Today's subject is disturbing. You'll have seen the notice warning people that the documentary you've just shown or just seen includes disturbing images. I'll just read the introduction to the press conference. Johnny Kitagawa was the most prominent figure in J-pop when he died in July 2019. He ran Japan's most powerful talent agency, Johnny and Associates, which ignited the careers of some of Japan's best-loved pop acts of the last 5 decades, including Four Leaves, Hikari Genji, SMAP, and Kinky Kids. But allegations of sexual misconduct followed him persistently throughout his career. These claims, of course, as you saw in the documentary, burst to the surface in 1999 when the weekly magazine Shukan Bunshun ran a series of articles alleging that Kitagawa systematically abused young boys. They had 12 witnesses in total. Kitagawa sued the publisher, Bungei Shunju, but the Tokyo High Court overturned an earlier legal decision in July 2003, concluding that Kitagawa's legal team had failed to counter-argue the allegations in the detailed testimony of 2 of those victims, those young boys. Kitagawa's appeal was finalized in 2005. Nevertheless, Johnny and Associates continued to manage a roster of young stars, and Mr. Kitagawa was never charged. The few journalists who covered the story were angry with the mainstream media that they had ignored the scandal, and one of the issues that we hope to discuss today is why the allegations against Mr. Kitagawa continue to be hidden. I just want to, before we go over to the 2 makers of the documentary, I just want to have a few bookkeeping things. One is, please, again, I know you've been warned, no film or video images or photographs are allowed of the movie. We're live streaming today for anybody who wants to spread the word. We have quite a number of people watching, but if you would like to let people know that, that would be great. We are hopefully going to speak via Zoom to the 2 makers of the documentary, that's Mobiin Azar and Megumi Inman. Hi.
Hello.
Hi, Megumi.
Hello.
How are you?
Oh, we're good, thanks.
Good.
Really
we can
good,
see you.
thank you.
Okay. I appreciate you've got up very early for us, right? It's what, 5 o'clock in the morning over there or something like that?
Just turned 6.
6 o'clock. Yeah.
All right. Well, thanks a million for that. Now, I understand you're both going to make a brief statement. Is that right? And then we're going to go to Q&A. All right. Who wants to go first?
I'll kick it off, thanks.
All right, Megumi.
Great, thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Megumi Inman. I am the director and producer of this documentary, Predator, The Secret Scandal of J-Pop. Firstly, I'd just like to say thank you to the FCCJ for having us here. This was a very difficult film to make, so it's really great that it's having the impact it is in Japan and that we're finally talking about these issues openly. I'd just like to spend a couple of minutes speaking about my experience investigating this story and how the BBC came to make it. And after that, Mobiin has a few things to say, and then we can move on to the Q&A. So to give you a bit of background about myself, I am mixed Japanese and British, and I grew up in Japan. I spent my pre-teen and early teen years in Tokyo. So like every Japanese kid, Johnny's boy bands were a part of my everyday life. They can't not be. They're everywhere and embedded in Japanese pop culture. So this story is particularly close to me. And the more we digged into it, the more shocking and important it became to tell this story as full as we could. The BBC started looking into this in 2019, and it was actually Johnny's death in August 2019 that sparked this investigation. But then COVID hit and we had to put the investigation on ice. In early 2002, last year, when it looked like Japan might open its borders, we picked up the investigation again, and last summer we were able to come to Japan to film. So I hope that explains the timings of why we're bringing this documentary to you now. Lastly, while making this documentary, we were turned down by many institutions and organizations. Everyone had their own reason why they didn't want to talk. So I'm especially grateful to all the brave men, the survivors, who did speak to us on and off camera. It takes a lot of courage to speak up against a powerful figure like Johnny Kitagawa, but they all did with the hope that this film would make a difference. So we're really pleased that this documentary is now available not only in Japan, but globally around the world on the BBC World News channel. Here in Japan, you can watch it tomorrow, Saturday at 6:10 in the evening, and then on Sunday at 5:10 in the morning, 11:10 in the morning, and then on Monday at past midnight. Thank you. I'll now pass it on to Mveen.
Thank
Thanks,
you,
Megumi.
Megumi. Thank you so much. So I am really grateful to be with you today, and thank you to the FCCJ for organizing today's event. I was the reporter on the film, so I worked closely with Megumi. My background, really, I should just explain that. I've been a journalist for almost 20 years. Predominantly, my work has been with the BBC. And I became a journalist because I believe really passionately in the concepts of journalism as public service, and I believe in public service broadcasting. Now, a lot of the projects that I've worked on over the years, whether they're in the UK or whether they're international, have included an element of exploitation. So that could be within the context of drugs and drug trafficking. I've done a lot of projects related to that. It could be within the realm of terrorism and grooming. I've done lots of projects related to that. It could be within the realm of sexual exploitation and sex work. And I've done lots of projects related to that. But this concept of exploitation has been a running theme. And in each of those contexts, and wherever I've done these films or made these projects or written these articles, there has been another consistent theme, and that consistent theme has been silence. So that could be the silence of a given community. It could be the silence of an establishment. It could be the silence of people who have power, who stand to lose power. That has been another consistent theme. And so the first time I heard about the story of Johnny Kitagawa was in 2019, and what really attracted me to the story and made me think it was something that I was interested in exploring was really this concept of exploitation, but also the silence. I think being on the ground with Megumi, I didn't expect the level of silence that we encountered and the brick walls we encountered in terms of organizations, journalists, corporations, people within the music industry being unwilling to share their experience. And often that was on record, which I think is sometimes understandable. Often it was off the record as well. So there was a complete kind of wall of silence in terms of people being willing to engage in any meaningful way. I think, though, I'm really pleased with the film because ultimately what we wanted to do is fuel discussion. And I think that has now started. So whether you see that in the online space or whether you see it within the select sections of Japanese press that have chosen to cover this story, or you see it in terms of the UK and the response to the airing of the film in the UK, that has now started. And I think that can only be a good thing. And just finally, I do want to, as Megumi said, express real gratitude, heartfelt gratitude to all the contributors who actually spent their time and were brave enough to talk about their experiences, regardless. And this is the thing, I think, for maybe an international audience, there could be a level of judgment in terms of how particular contributors see their experiences and how they process their experiences. Maybe the processing of those experiences doesn't match up to particular expectations and to what we assume their reading of a situation should be. regardless of that, I think all the contributors are hugely brave, and I think what they've done is amazing and requires a huge degree of bravery, and we couldn't have done it without them. So I'm indebted to them, and I'm really, really grateful to them, and I'm looking forward to answering your questions.
Thanks very much. Well, before we move to questions, we'll just clear up the legal stuff first. So first of all, we have a statement from the BBC, which I'll read out. The BBC is committed to highlighting important issues from around the world. This documentary investigates the little-known story of Japanese pop mogul Johnny Kitagawa and his long history of sexual abuse. After the defamation trial, a civil court in Japan found it to be true that Kitagawa had sexually abused boys. The documentary hears from those who say Kitagawa sexually abused them and examines the real-life consequences to his victims when the media and society remain silent on the issue. It is entirely in the public interest to bring attention to the decades of sexual abuse Kitagawa's victims have experienced, particularly due to the influence he continues to have over Japanese pop culture. We should also say that we have contacted Johnny and Associates, and we contacted them yesterday asking them if they would like to come and make a statement or respond to any of the allegations in the documentary. We're waiting for their reply. We do, of course, we're a forum for views, for people with different views, often clashing views. So we appreciate it's a controversial issue, but we have invited Johnny and Associates to come and talk to us. With all that behind us, I'll just scan the room. If anybody has a question, if you could put up your hand, indicate who you are, and then come to the mic, tell us your affiliation and your question. Thanks very much. I see Will's hand first.
Hi, Will Fee of the Japan Times. Mobeen mentioned the silence and brick walls that he'd encountered making this film. And I think the phrase he used was that it was hard to wrap his head around, which is a really understandable reaction. Mobeen, were you previously aware of issues limiting Japanese press freedom, particularly when covering the rich and powerful? And Megumi, having grown up here, were you surprised by the extent of those limits making this film? Thank you.
Thanks, Will.
Thank you, Will. So I would say I had a semblance of an understanding of the limitations on press freedom. I hadn't worked in Japan before, but I'd visited Japan, and whenever I visit a place, I'm interested in how local press works. And I'd had some of those conversations, and I'd read and understood a little bit about press freedoms. I think I'd really underestimated the extent to which that would affect reporting of a story, which is ultimately, if we kind of flatten it all down and just take the bare bones of the story, I believe this is a story about the powerful and people who have less power being exploited. So I believe there's a power dynamic at play in this story. And I think I'd underestimated how difficult it was for press inside Japan to kind of shift through that and power through that and report these stories. I think for me it was a learning experience, and Megumi certainly was on the ground for a long time before I got to Japan. So we'd have lots of editorial conversations going backwards and forwards. And then Megumi was on the ground, I think, for maybe 3 weeks before I got to Japan to start the shoot. And the theme of Japanese press not covering this story, I think, was probably one of the predominant conversations we had for weeks and months beforehand and during the planning. I think there's always, I'm an eternal optimist. So I think being on the ground, I always think that regardless of, perhaps there being a language barrier, perhaps there being a different culture, perhaps there being a different etiquette, I always assume that I'm going to be able to charm my way in. I'm going to be able to have, great conversations, and I'm going to be able to kind of get through that wall of silence. And I was really shocked, actually, at how on the ground, predominantly, that didn't happen. I do want to say, though, you know, whether they were on film or whether it was during the research process, there are grassroots level journalists within Japan who are doing brilliant work. And of course, you know, it would be completely wrong to not mention the brilliant journalists at Bunshun who did speak. I'm sure you saw them in the film, you know, and ultimately 20 years ago, they were looking at this story. And I think, you know, it would be wrong to say there aren't brilliant people inside Japan who are doing this work and who are speaking out and who are joining those dots. But to answer your question, I was shocked at the level of brick walling and the level of silence.
Thank you. Megumi?
Yeah, to follow on from Mabeen. So yeah, having grown up in Japan and I work in Japan quite a lot, when we were starting this investigation, I knew this was going to be a hard topic to get people to open up and talk about. But I think I did underestimate how scared people were to talk about and even meet me, speak to me. And you know, in Japan, there is growing up there, I know people are very conscious about reading the room, but this was on another level. And I think the other thing that surprised me was just to what extent this was still understood as a myth, an urban legend almost. It was sort of put into like celebrity gossip and wasn't really seriously treated as what we saw as child abuse. And so that was another surprising thing for me.
Thank you. If you'll allow me one question to both of you, really, I guess. As you know, the case that this often gets compared to is Jimmy Savile in the UK. Jimmy Savile, of course, kind of hid in plain sight, didn't he? Because he was one of the top celebrities in the UK for many years in the 70s and 80s. He was the presenter of Jim'll Fix It, a very popular show on the BBC, and also Top of the Pops. How far do you think those comparisons go? Because, you know, I've seen people online accusing the BBC of hypocrisy, saying, well, it's all very well and good for you to come over here and investigate a scandal in Japan, but what about the scandal on your own doorstep? So let me ask that question to both of you and see how you respond.
Sure. Megumi, can I take that first?
Yeah, please do.
So I think that comparison and any comparison to Jimmy Savile or Weinstein or R. Kelly or any of the kind of recent historic cases is entirely fair, actually. I think those comparisons automatically, when we hear a story as abhorrent as this, it is only natural in terms of how the human mind works to try to process this stuff in terms of what feels like stories that we have had some semblance of digesting and unpicking as a society. So I think those comparisons are fair. And I think where they're entirely justified is, like Johnny Kitagawa, Jimmy Savile was often seen as a national institution. He was seen as someone who had this national treasure status. And anyone who's kind of followed that case in recent years will see there was this kind of unholy triangle almost in terms of Buckingham Palace had relationships with Jimmy Savile. He was going to garden parties at Buckingham Palace. And so therefore governments, there was this assumption that, well, if Buckingham Palace has a relationship with him, everything must be fine. So then government was inviting him to Downing Street in the years of Margaret Thatcher. You know, so he was in Downing Street. There was often pictures of him on the steps of Downing Street doing quote unquote, you know, great work for the community. And then the third part of that triangle was the press. And yes, it was the BBC. So he had a job at the BBC. And there was an assumption, I think, between all three of those institutions that he must be okay and everything must be fine because you know, he is in with these major institutions of society. So I think all that is fine. What I think is unfair is the idea, and we often hear it, I think, when people don't want to talk about a particular issue that's in the public domain. We often hear this idea of go and sort your own house first. I think that's entirely unfair because, I mean, let's be frank about it. I'm an 80s child. So as a journalist myself, no one journalist can sort all the ills or shine a light on all the ills of the world. And in terms of quote unquote sorting out your own house first, I think these conversations about exploitation, about sex abuse, about people within the public eye exploiting their positions of power, I think those conversations should happen and need to happen everywhere in every context. I don't think there's good exploitation and bad exploitation. I think all exploitation is bad. And if that's happening in the UK, then it needs to be spoken about. I think historically with the Jimmy Savile case, it is undeniable that there were mistakes that were made. And it's undeniable that the story should have come out earlier. It only came out once again because there were brave people who were prepared to share their experiences. There were journalists doing good work, the establishment in the end, and it was the press, and I think it was ITV that broke the story in the end, effectively decide to roll up their sleeves, do their job, and cover this story. And I think wherever that happens and whatever context that happens in, whether it's the press from a particular country or it's press from outside that country, I think that can only be a good thing. And so I do buy the comparison. What I don't buy is this idea that this story should have been left and it shouldn't have been covered by journalists from the BBC. I don't agree with that at all.
Thanks, Mobeen. Megumi, do you have anything to add to that?
Not too much. I think Mobeen summarized it perfectly. The only small thing I would add is I think it actually took an outsider to be able to tell this story because there were too many relationships between the agency and the media within Japan and further afield. I think it actually took someone outside like the BBC to be able to tell this story that didn't have ties and to tell it fairly and for it to be a place where survivors could come and trust us and know that their story would be told fairly.
Thank you very much. Well, we have questions lined up online. Just let me scan the room. If you have a question that you'd like to ask, can you show your hand so I'll know that you want to ask one? The gentleman in front. First, if you come to the microphone, please. お願いします。
I'm Toshi Ogata with Arctimes online publication here in Japan. I have two questions. So, number one is that I would thank you very much for your great work and investigative documentary, and I really appreciate it. And I myself I'm shocked to see the gravity of the situation. Actually, I was at Asahi Shimbun, major Japanese newspaper, until last June, and so at the time, back in 2000, I was at Asahi for 29 years, and I have been a business reporter mainly. So that area was a remote area for me, but we have 2,000 reporters. But I just I didn't read much about weekly Bunshun at the time, and I know the rumor, but I didn't realize that there was a ruling in that magnitude. And actually, the cross-examination of Johnny Kitagawa himself, I didn't realize that. So I'm ashamed of myself to see this, and I thought I should have spoken up at the time.
Do you have a question, Ogawa-san?
Yes. So my question is that from your point of view, from your point of view, what do you make of the attitude or atmosphere of Japanese media compared to like the media in the UK or the rest of the world? That's my first question.
Thank you very much.
Second question.
You have another question?
Yes.
Okay. Do you guys want to do you want to address that question? Well, why don't you ask your second question?
Okay. So second question is about Jimmy Savile, as you raised. So I read the report, independent report commissioned by BBC. I think it's back in 2012. And I saw the statement by the director of the investigative committee, but I'm not really aware of any documentary on that by BBC. So, did you do this type of documentary at the BBC by BBC itself? And if not, is it still difficult for you guys to discuss this? To raise the possibility to this type of documentary on Jimmy Savile?
Thank you. So I see two questions. One is the different attitudes of the media in Japan, outside Japan, toward this case. And the second one is, has the BBC got to grips with this? I know there is a drama planned, isn't there? The BBC is making a drama at the moment, which is scheduled for release. But I'll let you guys answer that question.
Meg, do you want to comment first? Yeah,
I can go in first. So just about the attitude towards the media, to be honest, I can't really speak too much about the British media. I've been focused so much on this story. I can feel more comfortable talking about that. One thing that really is surprising is just how powerful Johnny's and Associates is, and how prevalent and omnipotent their presence is. It's not only music, they are in every popular, at least one of their talent is on every popular drama show. They're on, whenever you flick any channel, there will be a Johnny's Boy on one of the channels, at least. They are on adverts. They are, you cannot escape them. And I think that is something that it's hard to find a comparison to in the UK. And so you can start to see why perhaps the media is so dependent, not dependent, but starts to have a very strong and reliant relationship with this talent agency. As for Jimmy Savile, I can't name any documentaries off the top of my head. I feel like there have been, but maybe Mubin has known a bit more about that.
Sure. So thank you for the question. So I guess there's two parts to that question. So first, in terms of the comparison between UK and Japanese press, I would say absolutely that there are comparisons that can be made. And this is just my personal opinion. But I think quite often, in terms of public discourse, journalists are seen as a kind of specific breed of person. Whereas in actual fact, as journalists in the room or journalists watching online right now, I'm sure we can all say with confidence that journalists actually often just represent a cross-section of society, which means they're also susceptible to things like groupthink. Journalists are also susceptible to their logic in working out a story being affected by the prevailing logic of the moment, the prevailing logic of the time. Of course, we're human beings, and that's how the human mind works. And so I think those comparisons are entirely fair. What that means in a practical sense with a story like this is if all your colleagues around you and the prevailing narrative is, we might have heard rumors, but let's just say they're rumors, and this is a story that no one wants to touch, and there must be a reason for that, then that is going to affect the work of lots of journalists. Of course it is. And, do I think there's a comparison there in terms of what happened in Japan with Johnny Kitagawa? Yes, I do. The fact is that Bunshun did report this story. And of course, we know about the libel case. We know what was upheld in the courts in Tokyo. We know that the allegations of sexual abuse, effectively were spoken about in courts. So I think the distinction is, in the Jimmy Savile case, that didn't happen. There wasn't a court case. There wasn't a libel case. Claims weren't upheld in courts. I think that's the distinct difference. But journalists are often guilty of groupthink. And I think there's a lesson for that for every single one of us, including me. I think every single one of us, as journalists, we do our jobs better if we are interrogating the established narrative. And I think that's something that we should all be aiming to do. The second part of that question was about Jimmy Savile and the BBC in 2012. So specifically, I think many people in the room may have seen, I think it's a 3-part Netflix film that was made using lots of BBC archive. In-house at the BBC, this subject has been covered on outlets like Newsnight. Famously, there was a panorama that was delayed, but then did make it to air. And it's been covered by lots of the BBC News, the BBC website, and so forth. So I think absolutely in terms of working practices and in terms of the BBC, there has been a reckoning, and there is this constant kind of asking of questions of why this wasn't reported earlier. But again, you know, just in terms of the facts of the case and the chronology of the case, I think the distinct difference is in the case of Jimmy Savile, there weren't legal proceedings. In the case of Johnny Kitagawa, there were, and we all know about those, and they were in the public space. I would make that distinction.
Thank you. And that's a good point. I mean, there may not have been a standalone documentary on the BBC, but it was covered in multiple programs. That's a key difference, isn't it? If you think about the NHK comparison. Just to answer my own question about the drama, when you were talking, I was researching it. There's a drama which is about the Jimmy Savile case, which is due to be aired on the BBC this year. But there has been some allegations. The Sun, for example, claimed that BBC executives were concerned about putting the show on air before the coronation of King Charles. So because of Jimmy Savile's connection to King Charles, there was concern or debate within the BBC about that. I think that shows that it's still a difficult subject, but it doesn't show blank censorship, which is what the question was getting at. I'm just gonna go to this Jimmy Savile thing again because a lot of the questions refer to that, and hopefully this will be the last one if I can indulge your patience. This is an online question from Ronald Taylor of Nante, Japan, Nante. Why did you make this documentary now, years after Kitagawa's death? Is this documentary a way of atoning for the BBC's treatment of Jimmy Savile's similar case? I mean, you've already dealt with it, but you just want to sort of finally deal with that issue and then we'll move on?
Yeah, sure.
Go on, sorry.
No, I mean, I'm just going to be repeating myself a little bit here, but the Johnny Kitagawa is a powerful figure, and it's someone that the BBC have reported on him before for usually, you know, the many sort of business accolades that he has. But there's always been underneath, we've always said that there have been sexual allegations to his name. It was in 2019 when he died, the response to his death in Japan, he was celebrated as a national hero, you know, he was revered. And so, and very few media outlets in Japan looked at that other side of him that we had also been where we had looked in, mentioned about the sexual allegations. So that was the beginning, that's what sparked it, was the fact that there was just no highlighting of his sexual abuse. It was all positive, all just very revering, and that's what kicked it off. But like I said, the reason why we're showing it now is because of COVID. We couldn't come over here to Japan for a few years.
Got it. Okay.
Maybe
do you want to add anything to that?
Really briefly, I just want to say, I think I've just found out the BBC actually did do a documentary about the Savile case that went out in 2016. And I think it was called Abused, the Untold Story. I think it was a 90-minute film. I don't know if that's the drama or the doc, but there was actually a doc in 2016.
Okay, well, that's the end of that. Catherine, you have a question? Thank you. And again, reminder, I do have questions online. If you want to ask a question in the room, can you show your hand? Indicate you want to speak. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Catherine Jane Fisher, author, and thank you for this documentary. And I have been an advocate in Japan since 2002. So up until 20 years ago, there was no 24-hour rape crisis center. There were no rape test kits. And it is only until recently, in 2007, that the penal code was adjusted to to include men. So my question is, Japan is leading the world in many different areas, yet so behind in addressing sexual violence. So compared to the UK, and when you came here, how did you feel the support was, especially for the men, the victims, as some of the victims themselves were actually expressing trauma bond? And so what do you think the support was for the victims here?
Trauma bond means that they were still
They still feel
loved
affection
Kitagawa.
towards
Yep.
the perpetrator.
Thank you. Okay, thanks, Catherine.
Thanks.
Mobeen, do you want to go first, or?
Sure. Yeah, if that's all right, Meg.
Sure.
Cool. So I think it's a really important point, and I think it's a really important theme in the documentary. The phrase that you use, trauma bond. I think this is something that, as a public, and certainly me as an individual, I think we're only understanding in recent years. And I think one key example, and I think the first time I ever really saw it discussed in public was following the documentary Leaving Neverland, the Michael Jackson film. And I remember watching that, and I think a lot of people in the public space criticized survivors of abuse in that context, because famously, I think it was Wade Robinson that had testified in defense of Michael Jackson at a previous court case. And so that was used by some to make an attack and to belittle his testimony. And I think, for any right-thinking person or person that's interested in nuance, if you then unpick that case, and if you then unpick the kind of timeline of events, you understand this idea of survivors of abuse, regardless of gender, sometimes, and indeed often, being linked and still having feelings for their abuser. I think in the research for Predator, and before we came out to do the shoot, I was, and Megumi and I would have these discussions and we'd talk about this stuff. And so there was an element of being prepared to hear these stories. And of course, Megumi did, lots of amazing work and lots of amazing research. And we were having conversations about that all the time. Nevertheless, when you're sitting down with a contributor who is talking about what I certainly would perceive as abuse and a power imbalance, and yet they don't see it in those terms. And they'll go further, in fact. And as you saw in the film, there were references to particular individuals saying, I still love Johnny Kitagawa. I know what happened. Some of them said they witnessed what happened. Some of them said they'd heard about it. Some of them indeed had experienced it themselves. And then there's phrases thrown out there about a kind of amorous connection, a sense of love. When you're confronted with that, of course it's shocking. But what do we know? We say this in the film. That is exactly how grooming works. It is the person with the power. It is the person that is doing the grooming that will create this relationship in which the person that's being exploited believes that there's a special relationship, a special bond, a special secret. And everything that I know about this story and everything that I know from speaking to survivors is Johnny Kitagawa did exactly that. He was a master manipulator. He very successfully manipulated young men and boys and created this, what was seen to be a special bond. And that means, and I think this is one of the lessons from this, and it's one of the saddest things for me, is I think many of the people who spoke to us are still in the process of getting to the point where they actually believe that there was a power imbalance, and even being able to use a word like abuse. As you saw in the film, many of them wouldn't use that word. And keep in mind, those are the people that spoke on camera. Those are the people that actually felt confident enough and were brave enough to share their stories. And so it does really concern me that there will be other men out there who are not even at that stage, who are not even at the stage where they can say, okay, maybe something went on here. I think that's a real concern and a real problem.
Thank you. Megumi, do you want to add anything to that, or are you okay?
Oh, no, that's okay.
All right, thank you.
Okay, great, thanks.
Thanks, Catherine. Anybody else in the room want to ask a question? The gentleman at the back. Thank you.
I'm an associate member, and I'm retiree, but kind of a continuous amateur historical scholar. This is a very dramatic film, and I really respect FCCJ because I'm so much disappointed about the Japanese, Japanese major press. There's very little freedom of press, and the Japanese press really make sontaku in Japanese. So there's a big issue now about the government pressing the Japanese press right now in the diet. But the real problem is the kind of nature of the Japanese press, who really don't put it in the paper, and also like in your case, they don't bring the American foreign journalists into the club, and so on and so on. So this was very interesting, but my real, which is the issue? This sexual harassment case is horrendous, and they should do it. But for me, the bigger question is the deterioration and kind of ugliness of the Japanese press institution.
Is that your question? So you're asking about...
Yeah, so I think BBC, this is a great presentation, but maybe shifting to the attack to the Japanese press and how there's no press freedom in the Japanese society. This is much more important to the Japanese people.
Okay, so I guess if we could just reframe it as a question. So there's two parts to the documentary. One is about the physical abuse that Kitagawa perpetrated or allegedly perpetrated, and then the other question is about the media itself. And I get those were the two strands in your documentary, right, Megumi?
Yes, those are the main two strands. Obviously, the systemic child sexual abuse is horrific in itself, but just as surprising and harrowing was the silence, the complicit silence times as well that followed it for decades. We're talking here for decades, 50, 60 years. But I also think there were other themes to it as well, which Mabine touched upon, was the lack of vocabulary and discussion around what sexual abuse is. So, for example, I don't think in Japan the word grooming is really a word that exists. It's a word that even in the UK it's sort of come into our vocabulary recently. But I certainly found it difficult speaking to people in Japan explaining what grooming was, because it's just something that hasn't been talked about. And so that was one thing. I think also the way that children are protected in this case. So when it comes to sexual abuse in Japan is also alarming, and how whether the police looked into any of these allegations at the time when Bunshun reported on this, that was something that we also found to be shocking as well. So definitely the media was a big theme, but there were other themes as well which we felt were also really, really important and touches upon everyone's lives in Japan.
Thank you. Mobeen?
I think Megumi covered it. That's fine. Thank you.
Okay. Well, let me read out a question from online then. This is from Ilgin Yorulmaz. She's with your sister organization, BBC World Turkish. She says, are there any other plans to show this documentary in other languages covered by BBC World? So will it be shown in different languages other than English and Japanese, obviously? The second question is, has anyone from the Japanese government, police, judiciary commented on the documentary in a positive or negative way? Have you had any feedback from Japan at all since you broadcast it a couple of weeks ago?
Okay. I can take this, if that's okay, maybe. So whether it's going to be shown in other languages, so it will be shown on BBC World News, which reaches out to over 200 countries, 300 million households. We will have a Japanese subtitle version. Whether it's going to be subtitled into other languages, I personally do not know. But it is brilliant that is going out across. This is going out globally. feedback from Japan, it's been the reaction that we have had on social media is overwhelming, and it has often been sort of echoing what some of the voices that we have heard in today's forum today of I didn't know that this was true. Can't believe that it hasn't been reported before. And yeah, why is the BBC doing this, and why has it taken a foreign media outlet to report such a big story about Japan? So it has been, I would say, overwhelmingly positive on social media. When it comes to the other media outlets, mainstream media outlets of Japan, a bit like when we tried to contact them for interviews for the program, it's been quiet, if not silent.
Mobeen, do you want to add anything to that?
I think Megumi's covered it. Thank you.
Right. Well, I probably should mention at this point that the reason why we're having this press conference is because I tweeted out a link to the documentary fairly absentmindedly. I tweet a lot of stuff, and it got 18 million hits, which never happens on my Twitter account. I was really astonished that there was just this demand, I guess, or hunger for more information on the contents of your documentary. I should just say I'm getting a WhatsApp from the exec on the film who's very helpfully said the World Service languages will be showing the doc in various languages. Okay.
So it will be translated. All
right, that's good news. One more question from Ilgin Yolomaz of BBC. Claims of sexual harassment at the hands of their caretakers are rife in Japan, but the issue is seen as taboo. Were you surprised by the lack of scrutiny by the Japanese police, despite years of allegations? So we've focused so far on the media, but I guess the police should take a hit too, right? Because they didn't follow up.
Yeah. So if I could say this, I know in Japan there's a kind of, I would say, a fairly unique system whereby the police wouldn't speak to us, and primarily the reason for that wasn't a kind of we don't want to talk about this subject. It was more to do with it was a kind of logistical, kind of rules-based reason. And as many people will know, unless you're a foreign correspondent that's based in Japan, you simply can't have that interaction with police. And I found that incredibly frustrating because I have interviewed police in Pakistan, in the UK, in Mexico, in the US, in Canada, in various jurisdictions. And I've done interviews with lawyers, with law enforcement, with police themselves. All of that stuff is entirely possible. So this specific ruling in Japan, I'm not sure, and I can't speak on the police's behalf, of course, but I think what it does do is it allows the police in very specific contexts to avoid foreign scrutiny. And certainly, the fact that they wouldn't speak to us, and the fact that maybe there was an investigation following the libel case. We're never going to know that. Perhaps that was done behind closed doors. But what we know with absolute certainty is following the libel case, which is almost 20 years ago, that what we know with certainty is there wasn't a prosecution. We know there wasn't a prosecution of Johnny Kitagawa. And that to me is, of course, it's shocking. And I would say it's unforgivable because this, at the time, was in the public domain. And so in that moment, I find it very difficult to wrap my head around this idea of why there was no prosecution. Whether that prosecution would have been successful or not is an entirely separate matter, but it is the job of the police. Again, I go back to what I said right at the start, the idea of public service. The police, ultimately, as an institution, of course, is about protecting the public. It is about public service. And so I find it extremely shocking that there was no prosecution.
Thank you. Megumi?
No, Mobeen said it all.
All right, thank you. Just scanning the room again to see if anybody has a question. If you have, can you raise your hand, please? Let us know you want to ask one. We haven't mentioned the N word yet, guys, NHK, seeing as how, you know, the obvious comparison with the BBC would be NHK, another powerful public service broadcaster. You've also mentioned, you know, in many contexts, public service, the notion of public service. Do you think that Japan's public service broadcaster is on the hook here as well? Do you think they deserve some of the blame for this, what happened, for not digging into it?
Yeah, I could say this. I think both Mabine and I are very supportive of public broadcasters, and NHK does do great work as well. On this scenario, on this case, it does make me wonder why they wouldn't want to, well, they didn't report on it back then, but also when we approached them and, you know, to ask for their comments, for their response, to see what they had to say about it, we were politely declined. And I see that Johnny's talent frequently are on their network, on their broadcasting system. So it isn't something that's not to do with them. And so I do wonder why that they don't want to talk to us, and I find it troubling.
All right, thank you. Last question online. This comes from Rui Jodai of Netorabo. Did you apply for an interview with, you've already said you applied, but you were refused by the police. Did you apply for an interview with any other media apart from NHK and Shukan Bunshun?
Again, I can take this, that's okay, Mabine. We approached far and wide to all sorts of media outlets in Japan. I can't list them all, but to name a few, we did reach out to NHK. We reached out to the 4 major broadsheets, so Asahi Shimbun, Yomiuri, Sankei, and Mainichi. We reached out to entertainment reporters, TV producers, music producers. Some people, few, spoke to us off the record, and that they were you know, quite, I'd say, scared to do so, but they bravely did. But most of them, including the major outlets that I just mentioned, all politely declined, and they all had their own reasons why they didn't want to speak to us.
Thank you. And you uncovered, or you located, one former victim, is that right, in total, who spoke on the record?
We spoke to, well, in our film, there are three survivors.
Okay. And do you have any idea of how many there were in total? Has anybody speculated on that? I mean, obviously, if 3 people spoke to you, there are very many more in reality, right?
Oh, I mean, it's I can't even imagine how many there's. It's really, if you think about how many boys go through that agency and how it is sort of a revolving door, and if you were and the number of boys that would have gone to Johnny's house, I mean, hundreds, I would say. But I mean, Mabine, what do you think?
I mean, it's interesting you should raise this, because I think when we were on location and when Megumi was in the edit, I think this is a conversation we'd come back to often. Of course, it is entirely speculative, and there is a world in which we never actually find out as a public. We'll never know the exact number of people who suffered abuse at the hands of Johnny Kitagawa. I think the fact of the matter is we do know that there was a constant stream of boys and young men joining the talent agency with aspirations to become stars. There were many backing dancers. There were many people kind of, you know, who hadn't made their debut, who never even got there. And of course, Johnny Kitagawa had direct access to many of those individuals, all of those individuals. I think, you know, this is a term that we explore in the film. The fact that Johnny Kitagawa's homes were referred to as the dormitory or dormitories even, this was happening at various locations because there were so many boys sleeping over, I think perhaps gives us an indication of the scale of abuse here. And I think that it's terrifying and it's horrible to think about. I just don't know if we're ever going to be able to put an actual number to it.
And also to add to it, it's not just, this didn't just happen sort of in its heyday, in the heyday of Johnny Kitagawa. The first ever accusation or sexual allegations towards Johnny Kitagawa happened in the 60s. So this has been going on for decades, and he's always been, although there have been these allegations, Johnny Kitagawa remained in his position, and that never changed, and no one ever questioned his access, his proximity to young boys.
All right. Last question to you both then. What do you want to happen with this documentary? What would you like to see? I mean, you haven't had any reaction or much reaction yet in Japan. You haven't had much reaction from anywhere really from any institutions in this country, right? You've just said there was a phenomenal online reaction. What would you like to happen?
Hey, do you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I would like so much to happen, but I think having spoken to survivors closely and for over a long period of time, I do hope that this will help create an environment where people can speak out about the abuse that they may have experienced, and that people in power like Johnny Kitagawa and the Johnny Kitagawa will be held accountable, and that they will be held accountable.
I would just add to that. So firstly, I'd say, just once again, I want to express kind of absolute gratitude and absolute solidarity to everyone that spoke to us, and survivors that haven't spoken to us, who perhaps have seen some of the coverage or have seen some of the stuff online. I want to express solidarity with those people. In terms of what I want to happen, I think public discussion is crucial, and I appeal, I'm so grateful to everyone that is online or in the room today. I think as journalists, it is entirely our job to be fueling that public discussion. This is just personal to me. I am somewhat flabbergasted by the fact that there is still a company bearing the name Johnny Kitagawa, Johnny and Associates. The head of that company, of course, Judy Fujishima, is a family member. Of course, everyone that works there at a senior level or any level is still financially benefiting from what Johnny Kitagawa did, and that includes the abuse. And I think for a company to effectively wring its hands of any kind of accountability, any kind of safeguarding, is not fair. It's important to say, of course, at the end of the film, Judy Fujishima did provide a statement talking about working within the confines of the law and a new plan for 2023. I certainly don't believe Judy Fujishima or anyone from Johnny and Associates engaged with the allegations in any meaningful way. Of course, they eventually engaged, after multiple calls, emails, after turning up at the office, all of those things, they did engage. I certainly don't think they engaged in any meaningful way. And I think as a company and as an institution and organization that still profits to this day from what Johnny Kitagawa did and from the infrastructure he put in place, and still has young people within their care working there, I would like to see them change their practices, and I would like to see a very public acknowledgement of what happened and a very public acknowledgement of how they can do things better and how they can safeguard.
Well, thank you very much to Mobeen Azar and Megumi Inman, the makers of this documentary. Will you just remind people again that the documentary is going to be broadcast in Japan on Saturday? Did I get that right? And multiple times afterwards.
That's right. Saturday, 6:10 in the evening, and then on Sunday, 5:10 in the morning. 11 in the morning, and then on Monday at 10 past midnight.
All right, thank you very much. Sorry? Not on major channels. That's on BBC, right? BBC
On the
World.
BBC World News
BBC
channel.
World News Channel. Thank you. The comment was no major news channels are showing it. That's a problem. But presumably what you're hoping is that this will be picked up. Thank you so much again. A reminder that we have sent out a request to Johnny and Associates, giving them the right to reply. They have yet to do so. We're waiting for their reply. But if they do, of course, we'll air their comments. For Mobeem and Megumi, we do offer a year's a year's membership of the club to speakers. I'm waving them here so you can see. They're actually in my hand. So we'll send them to you in the post, and then next time you're in Japan, come and see us again, yeah?
Most
And
definitely.
all the best with your
Amazing.
movie.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very
Thank
much.
you.